Hey everyone, welcome to week 13 of Augmenting the Gallery. This is going to be our last proper lecture before the end of the semester. And this week we're going to talk about digital art and digital culture. So far we've been mentioning a lot what are some of the challenges of preserving and then communicating about physical objects. And let's see now how those challenges sort of update themselves in the 21st century when digital artifacts are part of our everyday lives. And so to do that, we're going to articulate this lecture in two sections. So this one is the one you're currently watching right now, is going to be about just an overview of the concepts and the challenges that arise from both digital artworks, as in fine arts, and digital culture in general. And then in the second part of the lecture, we'll have a conversation with Pachu, who was Associate Director of Design at Rhizome at the New Museum and has been working hands-on on some of these issues through her work on both New Museum and Web Recorder, which she will talk to us at length later. So let's get started. The biggest problem the first problem, there are a lot of problems. The first problem that curators and conservators are faced with when we're talking about digital art is how exactly is it defined? So we have a lot of words. We have like new media art, we have time-based art, we have digital art, we have computational art, we have software art, we have variable media art. One definition that I like is the one that's given by Joanna Drucker, which says that the basic characteristics of digital work are that it is programmable, iterative, generative, and networked. These are all sort of conceptual factors, and it's not tied at all to the materiality or the actual object, the actual thing. An example of that is one of my favorite pieces by the father, I guess, yeah, he would be the father of new media art, Nam June Paik. This is the TV Buddha, which is an installation with a Buddha, a TV, and a webcam and a camera. The interesting aspect, I mean, there are a lot of like conceptually interesting aspects of this work, but practically in terms of how do you present it in a museum, this piece has been shown and has been bought in many different iterations. It has been shown with like a full Buddha, like just the head of a Buddha, different kinds of videos, whether it was color, whether it was black and white. So the emphasis here was that this particular piece was more about the idea than about the realization. The details of the realization didn't matter that much. But at the same time, it did use hardware as a crucial conceptual component. Like this idea of the CCTV, of the closed circuit television, is something that came with the rise of cheap portable cameras, the rise of cheap screens. And it's something that Nam June Paik is exploring conceptually in this piece. So it is important that there is a camera and a TV. It doesn't really matter which camera or which TV it is. So that's kind of sort of the first issue. Like there is a stable state. We know what the piece is, but we don't know where the piece stops. It's kind of what's the name? Theseus's ship. I think it's Theseus's ship. Yeah. It's this like Greek myth where Theseus had a ship, and then the ship started to break down, and so they had to like slowly replace each board of the ship until one day all the boards on the ship had been replaced. And then the question is it still Theseus's ship? So if you replace all the physical component of something, does that thing still keep its identity? That's a problem that rose with video. For example, like, does it make sense to show the work of Nam June Paik on an HD screen? And they reflect a lot of the conflicts that curators today have when it's about showing digital art. There's a conflict between intent, hardware, and presentation. And these are all very tightly intertwined. So hardware has a couple of issues. One is that sometimes it's essential to understanding the piece. A famous example of that is the video game Space Invaders, which you might have played in one form or another. You have rows of aliens going down the screen, and you have a little ship at the bottom that's shooting bullets to the aliens, and you have to survive as long as possible. And so the designer of the game was also the designer of the circuit board that went into the arcade. And he designed it in such a way that it wasn't expected, but as every time you would destroy an enemy, the whole group of the remaining enemies would speed up. And that was because memory was freed on the circuit board itself, and then it would speed up CPU processing cycles, and therefore make the game faster. And so that's now understood as like a design feature, something that would have been a choice, but really was just an accident of the hardware. So to what extent do we recreate that feeling of like speeding up on, let's say, like a web version of Space Invaders? Or to what extent do you really understand Space Invaders by playing the original arcade and by interacting with that hardware? The issue that we might have is that the artists are still, on the one side, the artists are still, most of them, alive, so they have a say about what their piece should be, or they have a say about the fact that they don't care about what their piece should be or should be presented. But at the same time, we don't yet have an organized way of talking about a particular piece and saying why it is important at a particular moment or not. Like we just mentioned a whole different gamut of words that we use for new media or for digital art. We still haven't agreed on what is digital media and how it should be presented, because then the presentation is also something that wasn't really an issue for older museums, because it was impossible to find some of the pieces that were displayed. It was impossible to find them in their natural habitat, right, or quote unquote natural habitat. So for instance, if you have like a bronze helmet from like 12th century China, most likely there's no soldier that's around to like wear the bronze helmet. If you're displaying Space Invaders somewhere, there might be a bar somewhere, or if you're displaying Space Invaders at MoMA, there might be a bar somewhere which still shows Space Invader, right? Or someone might still have a copy of Space Invader on like their old computer. And so there's a difference between the original moment at which the work was created, the moment at which it was received and used by the public, and the moment that it is shown and preserved in a museum. And so in classical museums, those time spans are very, very far apart. In digital art, they're sort of coming together. And so then becomes the question of how do you best do justice to that piece? Like, why are you showing that piece? Do you want to show it for the intent of the artist? And if you take the designer of Space Invaders, then his intent was to have as many people have fun in arcade, in like, you know, those big arcades in Japan, and he would just go in like the arcades and just watch people play all day. Apparently, he wasn't even able to finish like level 2; it was too hard for him. But that was his intent. For the sort of the use of the public, what is everybody's relationship to Space Invaders, right? Did we all play Space Invaders on computers, and therefore should it be shown on a computer? Should the computer version be shown at the same time as the original arcade version, so that people can actually have like grasp the difference between hardware and sort of educate them about the texture and the materiality of the object? And finally, the sort of educational or academic understanding of what Space Invaders is and what kind of impact it had culturally on digital games, real-time graphics rendering, and in our interaction with the digital world in general. So these are the three conflicts between intent, hardware, and presentation. An example of that as well is Tetris. So you guys all know Tetris. It was made by a Soviet scientist in 80s, 70s, and it was originally developed for a computer that didn't have a display, didn't actually have like a screen. And so the way they played it was to connect a screen that only had letter characters that were displayed. And so the original Tetris is just played with like bunches of letters that are assembled into tetraminos, and then you would play it like this. But then turns out it was released by Nintendo on the Game Boy, and that became one of the best-selling titles of all time. And so Tetris what the original Soviet scientist intended to be in his lab in Moscow? Or is Tetris what the Japanese did with it by broadcasting it to the world? Or is Tetris the thing that people sometimes play on their computer or on their phones? Which one is the real version, right? And more importantly, how does it relate to the audience? Would it be interesting for them to know that it was made in the USSR and only focus the exhibition on the USSR? Or is it more about, oh man, I remember having that Game Boy and I remember having that feeling of like hunching over a tiny screen and being enthralled by that for youth, teens, adulthood? Because there is the part of engagement. Digital art is something that's participatory. It's something that we all have a history of engaging with. We've been on websites, we've played video games, we've interacted with computers, we've been on iTunes, we've had apps on our phones. And so if we think about the procedural rhetoric article that we read at the beginning of the semester about how people make points by sort of procedures, does that mean that by playing the game, by interacting with the digital artwork, you already understand immediately what it's about, right? Because we've seen that a lot of the solutions that traditional museums offer to understand objects better is by allowing user interaction, right? And it's supposed to like improve on the knowledge of what the piece is. The issue here is kind of the opposite, that everyone has sort of a like existing knowledge of what it means to interact with a piece like this. Everybody kind of knows how to use a joystick, how to press a button, how to use a touchscreen, and so people are expecting to interact with it. Just because they're interacting with it, do they understand what the piece actually means, right? The image you see here is a piece called Access that was shown at Ars Electronica in 2000s-ish, and it was a computer vision piece where there's a spotlight that picks someone in a hallway and follows them, and so the piece is half about the technology of like having that light moves and highlight you. And half about the audience's reaction, right? About the actual feeling of being in the spotlight, of being followed and not being able to escape the sort of highlight that is put on you. And so the sort of ambivalent or ambiguous reaction that we have to fame, really. And so the question now is, who is the real audience of that piece? Is it us watching the video later? Is it the people watching the one person on whom the spotlight is laid in the hallway in the early 2000s in Austria, in that particular place? Or is it the person that's interacting with the piece, right? There are different levels of audiences, and so the curators now have this problem of like, what is the real way of interacting with the piece? Is there a real way? And if there's no one real way, how do we accommodate all those different particular ways? And there's really there are different approaches to answering these questions. And it's still a young field, and it's still uncertain what is the best approach. Some institutions prefer complete archival and try to make sure that the object remains as pure, quote unquote, as possible, or others just think about accessibility and try to make it accessible to as many people and sort of recreate the feeling of the piece rather than the aspect or the form. So that's for digital art. The other question that we have is